Hi, I'm Brooke, and welcome to Sanding 101. There are a lot of different sanders on the market, so it's hard to know which one you're supposed to use. We're going to talk about which sander goes with which project, how to use them the proper way, and how to know which sandpaper to use to make sure your furniture pieces or whatever you're working on comes out perfect. We're going to start with my favorite sander. It's my go-to, mainly because it's battery powered and I have the ability to take it and use it anywhere without having to drag an extension cord around with me. This is a random orbital sander. So it's called a random orbital sander because it randomly moves in a circular pattern. You'd use this on a large piece of furniture, a large piece of wood when you're sanding it because you're gonna get these random patterns where that you don't have streaks in your wood. It works fast, but it doesn't dig into the wood unless you physically dig this into your wood. This, on the other hand, is an orbital disc sander. So it looks a lot like this one, but I didn't call it a random one because it doesn't move in a random pattern. It just stays stationary and vibrates. This one you have to use two hands on. It has a little knob that goes right here. It's so powerful. Your arms will ache after using it. This can really dig into the wood when you're working unless you can keep it really steady. I think I borrowed the handle to work with my grinder, so that's why it's not on here right now. I don't use this very often, but it's very powerful. If you really need to get deep into the wood, this is a good one. Or if you're trying to go for a pitted look, this is the one you want to go with. Next, we're going to talk about the sander that we probably all grew up with, and it's just a finishing sander. It's square. You have to actually physically cut your own pieces of sandpaper to go on here. You cut them in squares because they come in big sheets, and then once you have it on here, you tuck it into place and lock it in with these little metal clips, and then you can go to town. This one only moves with your movement. So it vibrates, but you are going to actually sand with this. So it's a finish sander because a lot of times you'll use your orbital sander in order to get the majority of the wood sanded down, but this is gonna go in line with the grain of the wood so that you don't have scratch marks all across your wood. I like to use this one on furniture. I like to use it for staircases, anything that once I've gotten the majority of the sanding done with this one, I go back and do my finish sanding with the finish sander. Lastly, we're going to talk about the finish sander. And this one is great because it's so tiny. It can get into all the little crevices, all the things that are hard to reach. This is the perfect one for. So I only use this when I'm getting into the corners and crevices, but whenever I need that and I can't get this one into it or my finish sander into it, this little guy comes to the rescue and finishes the job off perfectly. There are other sanders that are on the market that you can use, like a drum sander that stays stationary or a belt sander that you would refinish hardwood floor with, but you don't need those to get started. Really and truthfully, if you're only going for one sander, this random orbital sander is great. You can get one that's corded. I personally like the one that's battery powered because I can take it anywhere, but this is really all you need to get started. If you're a little more advanced and really trying to do some good finish work, I'd get one of these as well, but these are the two that you really need. If you're starting to get into some really intricate things, you're gonna want one of these. And then if you're doing outside projects, if you wanna sand a whole fence that's a mile long, this one might be the one you'd use. Just remember, this one's only corded. You can't get it in a battery-powered sander, so have a really long extension cord if you're going to sand your fence line. All right, you've gone and bought your random orbital sander, whether it's battery-powered or it's got a cord. Now you need to know what type of sandpaper to buy. First, you need to notice how many holes your sander has. So this one has 8 holes. So you need to make sure that you get a sandpaper that has at least 8 holes. Your sandpaper doesn't have 8 holes, but your sander has 8 holes. There's not gonna be enough holes to allow all the sawdust that you're sanding off go into this little bag, or if you're connecting this to a vacuum cleaner, it's not gonna suck it out because it's blocked. So you wanna make sure you have at least enough holes in your sandpaper as in your sander. So now it's time to decide which type of sandpaper to use for your project. There are a gajillion different types of sandpapers. You've got sandpaper from 40 grit all the way up to 1,000 grit, which is like what you'd use to refinish a car. So you probably don't need that when you're working with wood, but if you want something to be piano smooth, you might need 1,000 grit. Most of the time, if you're refinishing something, you are going to want to start with 80 grit sandpaper, which is this one. It's gonna be a thicker grit. It's gonna feel really sandy and rough. And then you're gonna work your way up to the higher grit sandpaper, like 120 or 220, so that you get a better finish. If both of your types of sandpaper come in boxes like this, they're the same color, you get them mixed up and you're like, I don't know which is which. There's a cheat guide on the back. It's kind of faint, but it does show you that this is 80 grit, this is 120, and so on. So then you'll be able to remember which sandpaper you're supposed to be using at this point. Another thing I want to talk about is when to swap out your sandpaper, because sometimes you're going to town, you feel like you're really having to apply a lot of pressure and you're wondering, do I switch it out? Is it too soon to switch it out? I like to say that if your sandpaper has big places like this in it that shows you've dug it into the corner or it's losing the grit on some of the places, if you're sanding something that has a top coat on it like polyurethane, sometimes even paint, it's gonna gum up your sandpaper. So you're gonna have these tiny little balls that are really hard in your sandpaper, and it's gonna leave streaks as it digs into the wood. You're gonna need to change out your sandpaper more often when that happens. And more than likely, you need to turn down the speed on your sander so that it's not heating up as much, because it's literally melting the paint and the vibrations are balling it up and then it's digging down into your wood. So you don't want that. Turn down your speed. Use a lower grit sandpaper like 80, 40, 60, whichever one you want to start with that top coat and then work your way up. Hopefully you'll eliminate getting so many of those into your sandpaper. Just make sure that you're changing them out, especially if they have marks in them or if they've got clumps of glue or paint stuck in them. It's time to switch them out so that you don't dig down into the wood grain. Lastly, you want to make sure you always use proper safety gear. I like to always have these handy. They're easy. Sometimes I wear my sunglasses if I don't have them handy. Just protect your eyes. All it takes is one little piece of wood coming off and going into your eye and losing your eyesight. It's not worth it. Just throw these on. The other thing that's not as fun to wear is a mask. I know it's really hot when you have to wear it, but it's not good for all the sawdust to go into your lungs. And if you're not in a well-ventilated area, it's even worse. So have one of these, change out the cartridges often. If you don't change out the cartridges, then you're not really doing yourself any good. It's really important to wear this. My grandfather, who was a woodworker his whole life, absolutely tells me every time I talk to him to be wearing these, and sometimes I listen, sometimes I don't, but he's had COPD for years now, and I know that he would go back and wear a mask every time now if he could, so it's really important to wear these. I hope this helps, and now you know what type of sander you need for which project you're working on, and also which type of sandpaper to use for the project. Remember, these are just the sanders that I like to use and that I would recommend for a beginner to an intermediate woodworker. If you're more advanced, there's much more intricate sanders that you can get. This is the sander that I would recommend for you to start with, second sander to get, third sander to get, and you'll be pretty set with that.